The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner cast a pale glow over the checkered linoleum floor as Marcus Thompson slid into his usual booth near the back corner. The red vinyl seat creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that had become part of his Tuesday night routine over the past 8 months. Outside, the Nebraska wind whistled through the bare branches of oak trees, carrying the promise of another harsh winter. Marcus kept his head down as he studied the laminated menu, though he already knew what he'd order. The same thing every Tuesday: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Predictability had become his anchor in a world that often felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. "Evening, Marcus," said Betty, the middle-aged waitress who'd been working at Murphy's for 20 years. Her weathered hands held a steaming pot of coffee, and she filled his cup without asking. She'd learned months ago that he preferred it black and strong. "Evening, Betty." His voice was quiet but steady, carrying just a hint of the Oklahoma drawl he'd never quite shaken, despite years of travel. "How's your grandson doing with that broken arm?" Betty's face lit up. It amazed her how this quiet man always remembered the small details about her family, her life. "Much better, thanks for asking. Doctor says the cast comes off next week. He's been driving his mama crazy, wanting to get back to football practice." Marcus nodded, managing a small smile. Boys that age, they bounce back quick. As Betty walked away to place his order, Marcus's eyes swept the diner with practiced efficiency. 12 other customers scattered across the red booths and chrome stools at the counter. Old farmer in overalls nursing coffee and pie. Young couple sharing a milkshake, lost in each other's eyes. Truck driver reading a newspaper while working through a stack of pancakes. And then there were the 3 men at the front booth. Marcus had noticed them the moment he walked in. Their loud voices cutting through the diner's usual quiet hum, the way they gestured aggressively while talking, the empty beer bottles accumulating on their table despite the diner's no-alcohol policy. They'd clearly been drinking elsewhere before coming here, their faces flushed and their movements loose with intoxication. The largest of the 3, a man with thinning hair and a beer gut straining against a stained flannel shirt, was telling some story that involved a lot of arm-waving. His companions, one thin and nervous-looking, the other stocky with a patchy beard, laughed too loudly at everything he said. Marcus turned his attention back to his coffee, taking slow, deliberate sips. The warmth spread through his chest, helping to ease the constant tension he carried in his shoulders. He'd learned to find small comforts where he could: the ritual of his Tuesday dinner, the familiar weight of his coffee cup, the steady rhythm of rain on the diner's tin roof. "Here you go, honey," Betty said, sliding a plate of steaming food in front of him. The meatloaf was thick and hearty, the mashed potatoes smooth as silk, the green beans cooked just right. Simple, honest food that reminded him of childhood dinners with his grandmother. He was halfway through his meal when he heard the commotion at the front of the diner. The 3 men's voices had grown louder, more belligerent. The nervous-looking one was standing now, pointing at something outside the window. "I'm telling you, that's the same guy," he was saying, his words slightly slurred. "The one who got Jimmy fired from the plant." Marcus kept eating, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared slightly, his breathing deepened, and his free hand moved to rest casually on the table where he could move quickly if needed. These were subtle changes, invisible to most observers, but they represented years of training kicking in automatically. The largest man turned in his booth, his bloodshot eyes scanning the diner until they landed on Marcus. "And which one? The Mexican-looking guy in the corner?" Marcus wasn't Mexican. His dark complexion came from his Cherokee grandmother's side of the family, but he'd heard worse assumptions and learned long ago that corrections rarely helped in situations like this. He took another bite of meatloaf and kept his expression neutral. "That's him," the thin man insisted, his voice rising with alcohol-fueled confidence. "Jimmy said he was some kind of foreigner, taking jobs from real Americans." The stocky one with the patchy beard leaned forward, squinting across the diner. "Doesn't look like much to me. Probably one of those illegals the government keeps letting in." Marcus set down his fork with deliberate care. He'd been through this dance before, in other diners, other towns, other situations, where his appearance and quiet demeanor made him a target for people looking for someone to blame for their problems. Usually, he could diffuse things with calm words and steady behavior. Usually, but as he watched the 3 men exchange glances and begin to slide out of their booth, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that meant trouble was coming, whether he wanted it or not. Betty appeared at his elbow, her face creased with worry. "Maybe you should finish that to go," she whispered, glancing nervously at the approaching men. Marcus looked up at her kind face and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of asking for a container, instead of slipping out the back door like he had so many times before, he picked up his fork and took another bite. "It's fine, Betty," he said quietly. "I'm not done eating yet." The three men approached Marcus's table with the swagger of people who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. The largest one, Marcus had mentally tagged him as Flannel, took the lead, his boots loud against the linoleum floor. The thin, nervous one followed close behind, while the stocky, bearded one hung back slightly, perhaps retaining some fragment of survival instinct despite the alcohol. "You mind if we join you?" Flannel asked, though he was already sliding into the booth across from Marcus without waiting for an answer. His breath reeked of cheap beer and cigarettes. Marcus didn't look up from his plate. "Actually, I do mind. I prefer to eat alone." The thin man laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. "See? I told you he was stuck up. Thinks he's better than us regular folks." "That's not what I said," Marcus replied calmly, cutting another piece of meatloaf. His voice remained level, but Betty, still hovering nearby, noticed that his left hand had moved to the edge of the table. She'd seen enough bar fights in her 20 years at Murphy's to recognize the signs. Flannel leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "So what's your story, friend? You one of those illegals taking American jobs? Or maybe you're some kind of terrorist, huh?" A few other diners had started to notice the confrontation. The old farmer looked up from his pie, his weathered face creasing with concern. The young couple stopped sharing their milkshake, the girl gripping her boyfriend's arm nervously. The truck driver folded his newspaper and turned slightly in his stool, ready to intervene if needed. Marcus finally looked up, meeting Flannel's bloodshot eyes directly. "I'm an American citizen born in Oklahoma. I work at Peterson's Auto Shop on Main Street. I pay my taxes, mind my own business, and I'd appreciate it if you'd do the same." The stocky, bearded man snorted. "Peterson's? That old fool's been hiring wetbacks for years. Probably pays you under the table, too." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a flash of steel that made Betty take an involuntary step backward. But his voice remained calm when he spoke. "I think you gentlemen have had a bit too much to drink tonight. Maybe you should head home, sleep it off." Flannel's face flushed red. "Don't tell us what to do, boy. We got every right to be here, same as you." He reached across the table and knocked over Marcus's water glass, sending ice and liquid spilling across the formica surface. That's when the 15 seconds began. Marcus didn't react to the spilled water immediately. Instead, he carefully set down his fork, placed his napkin beside his plate, and looked directly at each of the three men in turn. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving them every chance to de-escalate. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to walk away from this table. Right now. No harm, no foul." The thin man laughed again, emboldened by alcohol and group mentality. "Or what? You gonna call the cops on us? We ain't done nothing wrong." "Yeah," Flannel added, standing up from the booth. "Maybe it's time somebody taught you some manners." He reached for Marcus's shoulder, intending to grab his shirt and haul him out of the booth. Marcus moved. What happened next took exactly 15 seconds, though to the witnesses it seemed both instantaneous and eternal. Marcus's right hand came up and caught Flannel's wrist in a grip that made the bigger man's eyes go wide with sudden pain. At the same time, Marcus slid smoothly out of the booth, using Flannel's forward momentum to spin him around and drive him face-first into the table with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting wet concrete. The thin man, seeing his friend go down, swung a wild haymaker at Marcus's head. Marcus ducked under the punch with fluid economy of motion, his left hand shooting out to strike the man's solar plexus. The thin man doubled over, gasping, and Marcus's knee came up to meet his descending face. The crack of cartilage breaking echoed through the suddenly silent diner. The stocky, bearded man had more sense than his friends, but not enough. He was backing away, hands raised, when Marcus turned to him. For a moment their eyes met, and the bearded man saw something that made his bowels turn to water. "I'm sorry," the bearded man stammered. "We didn't mean nothing. We'll go right now." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Get your friends and leave. Don't come back." The bearded man hurried to collect his groaning companions. Flannel was conscious but dazed, blood streaming from his nose. The thin man was curled in a fetal position, whimpering softly. Together they made an undignified exit, the bearded man half carrying, half dragging his friends toward the door. As the diner door swung shut behind them, complete silence fell over Murphy's. 12 pairs of eyes stared at Marcus, who calmly returned to his booth and picked up his napkin to wipe water from the table. "Betty," he said quietly, "could I get another glass of water, please? And maybe a fresh napkin?" Betty stood frozen for a moment, then hurried to comply. As she set the new glass down, her hands were shaking slightly. "Marcus," she whispered, "where did you learn to do that?" Marcus looked up at her kind face, the same face that had brought him coffee and meatloaf every Tuesday for 8 months, never prying, never pushing, just accepting him as he was. "Afghanistan," he said simply. The word hung in the air like a revelation, explaining everything and nothing at the same time. The silence in Murphy's diner stretched for nearly a full minute after Marcus spoke that single word, Afghanistan. Betty stood beside his table, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her weathered hands, while the other diners remained frozen in their seats like actors waiting for their cue. Marcus picked up his fork and resumed eating as if nothing had happened, but Betty noticed the slight tremor in his left hand, the only sign that the confrontation had affected him at all. She'd seen that same shake in her late husband's hands after he'd returned from Vietnam, back when they were young, and she still believed that love could heal all wounds. "How many tours?" she asked softly, refilling his coffee cup. "3. Marcus didn't look up from his plate, but his voice carried the weight of those years. 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, Army Rangers. The truck driver at the counter, a burly man named Carl who'd been coming to Murphy's for 15 years, slowly turned around on his stool. "Rangers? No kidding." There was a new respect in his voice, the recognition of one veteran acknowledging another. "Thank you for your service." Marcus nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that carried more meaning than a lengthy speech. Around the diner, the other patrons began to relax, conversations resuming in hushed tones. But everything had changed. The quiet man in the corner booth was no longer just Marcus the mechanic. He was Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, U.S. Army Rangers, and that knowledge shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Betty slid into the booth across from him, something she'd never done before in all their Tuesday night encounters. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Marcus set down his fork and finally met her eyes. "What was I supposed to say? That I spent 6 years learning how to kill people efficiently? That I can field strip an M4 carbine blindfolded, but I can't sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat?" He shook his head. "People don't want to hear that, Betty. They want the hero version, the clean story where everything makes sense." "Those boys didn't know what they were dealing with," Carl called from the counter. "Probably never been in a real fight in their lives." "That's exactly why I didn't want this to happen," Marcus replied, his voice tight with frustration. "I came here for peace and quiet. I fix cars, I eat dinner, I go home. Simple, clean, no complications." But even as he said it, Marcus knew that his carefully constructed routine had just shattered. Word would spread through Millfield by morning. Small towns had their own efficient communication networks, and a story like this would be front-page news in the local gossip mill. Betty reached across the table and patted his hand gently. "Sometimes complications find us whether we want them or not, honey. The question is what we do with them." Before Marcus could respond, the diner door chimed, and Sheriff Janet Morrison walked in. She was a tall, lean woman in her early 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been sheriff for 8 years, long enough to know every face and every story in Millfield. Her gaze swept the diner, taking in the overturned chairs, the small bloodstain on the floor near Marcus's table, and the carefully neutral expressions on everyone's faces. "Evening, folks," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her badge. "I got a call about some kind of disturbance. Anyone want to fill me in?" The silence stretched again, but this time it was protective rather than shocked. The unspoken code of small-town loyalty had kicked in. Whatever had happened here, it was their business, not something to be shared with outsiders, even if that outsider wore a badge. Carl cleared his throat. 3 drunk idiots came in causing trouble, Sheriff. Got themselves worked up over nothing and took a tumble on their way out. Clumsy bunch." Sheriff Morrison's sharp eyes moved to Marcus, taking in his military bearing, his calm demeanor, the way he sat slightly angled toward the door with clear sight lines to all entrances. She'd seen enough veterans over the years to recognize the signs. "That right, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus Thompson. He didn't stand, but his posture straightened slightly. The gentleman in question had been drinking and became belligerent. I defended myself when they became physical. They left under their own power. Morrison studied him for a long moment. You wouldn't happen to be the Marcus Thompson who works over at Peterson's auto shop, would you? Yes, ma'am. Jim Peterson speaks highly of you. Says you're the best mechanic he's had in 20 years. She paused, her expression thoughtful. Military. Army Rangers. Discharged 2 years ago. Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place. The quiet newcomer who kept to himself, the precision of his movements, the way he'd handled 3 attackers without breaking a sweat. Well, Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your honesty. I don't suppose you'd be willing to come down to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement? Just for the record. Marcus hesitated. Official statements meant paperwork, questions, background checks. It meant people digging into his past, into things he'd worked hard to leave behind. Nothing formal, Morrison added, reading his reluctance. Just a conversation. Help me understand what happened here tonight. I'll be there, Marcus said finally. After the sheriff left, the diner slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, coffee was refilled, and life went on. But Marcus knew that his anonymity in Millfield was over. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know that the quiet mechanic was a decorated war veteran, and with that knowledge would come expectations, assumptions, and complications he wasn't sure he was ready to handle. As he finished his meal, Betty appeared with a slice of apple pie he hadn't ordered. On the house, she said with a smile. Heroes eat free on Tuesdays. Marcus looked down at the pie, golden crust still warm from the oven, and felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run or stay. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Marcus pulled into the parking lot of Peterson's auto shop, but he could already see Jim Peterson's truck in its usual spot. At 62, Jim was one of those men who believed that hard work was both virtue and therapy, and he'd been opening the shop at 6 a.m. every morning for the past 30 years. Marcus sat in his truck for a moment, watching the orange light creep across the frost-covered windshields of the cars, waiting for repair. 3 Honda Civics, a Ford pickup with a blown transmission, and Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick that needed new brake pads. Simple mechanical problems with clear solutions. Unlike the complications swirling around his life after last night's incident, he'd barely slept, his mind cycling through the confrontation at Murphy's and its potential consequences. The old hypervigilance had kicked in, leaving him alert and restless, ears tuned to every sound outside his small apartment. By 4 a.m., he'd given up on sleep and spent an hour doing push-ups and sit-ups, trying to burn off the nervous energy that combat had programmed into his system. The shop's side door opened, and Jim Peterson emerged, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. He was a compact man with silver hair and the kind of steady, reliable presence that made people trust him with their most valued possessions. He spotted Marcus's truck and waved him over. "Morning, Marcus. You're here early, even for you." Marcus climbed out of his truck, grabbing his tool bag from the passenger seat. "Couldn't sleep, figured I might as well make myself useful." Jim studied his employee's face. The slight tightness around the eyes, the way he held his shoulders just a fraction too high. Heard there was some excitement at Murphy's last night. Of course he'd heard. In a town of 8,000 people, news traveled faster than gossip at a church social. Marcus wondered how many different versions of the story were already circulating. Some drunk guys got out of hand. It's handled. That's what I figured. Jim took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "You know, in 30 years of running this place, I've learned to read people pretty well. Had to, if I wanted to stay in business. When you walked in here 8 months ago, I could tell you were carrying something heavy. Military, I guessed, but I didn't pry. Figure a man's past is his own business, unless he chooses to share it." They walked toward the shop together, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Jim unlocked the main door and flipped on the overhead lights, illuminating rows of tools, diagnostic equipment, and the organized chaos of a working garage. "But after what happened last night," Jim continued, "I'm guessing people are going to start asking questions, wanting to know more about Marcus Thompson, war hero." Marcus winced at the phrase. "I'm not a hero, Jim. I'm just a guy who learned some skills he wishes he could forget." "Maybe so. But that's not how folks around here are going to see it." Jim poured a second cup of coffee from the pot he kept in his small office and handed it to Marcus. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Marcus could answer, The front door chimed, and both men turned to see Sheriff Morrison walking in. She was in uniform, her duty belt creaking softly as she approached them. "Morning, Jim. Mr. Thompson." She nodded to each man in turn. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by early, but I wanted to catch you before things got busy." "No problem, Sheriff," Jim said. "Coffee?" "Thanks, but I've already had my limit for the morning." Morrison turned to Marcus. "I was hoping we could have that conversation I mentioned last night, if you're willing." Marcus glanced at Jim, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Sure. Here, or at the station?" "Here's fine. Jim, you mind if we use your office for a few minutes?" Jim's small office was cramped but comfortable, with a desk covered in invoices, a filing cabinet that had seen better decades, and framed photographs of classic cars on the walls. Marcus sat in the visitor's chair while Morrison settled behind the desk, pulling out a small notebook. "This isn't an interrogation, Mr. Thompson. I'm not taking a formal statement or filing charges. I just want to understand what happened last night, so I can decide if there's anything I need to worry about going forward." Marcus appreciated her direct approach. He gave her a concise account of the evening, the three men's arrival, their escalating aggression, his attempts to de-escalate, and the brief physical confrontation that followed. Morrison took notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. When he finished, she set down her pen and studied him carefully. 15 seconds, she said finally. "That's what Betty told me. 3 men down in 15 seconds, minimal injuries, maximum effectiveness. I used appropriate force to neutralize the threat and ensure my safety." Spoken like someone who's given after-action reports before. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "How long were you in?" 6 years, 3 deployments. "Combat?" Marcus nodded. "Mostly counterinsurgency operations. Some direct action." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Look, Marcus, can I call you Marcus? I've been sheriff here for 8 years. Before that, I was a deputy for 6. I've seen my share of bar fights, domestic disputes, and general small-town drama. What happened last night wasn't a bar fight. That was a professional dealing with amateurs. I didn't want it to happen. I believe you. But here's the thing. Word's already spreading about what you did. By noon, half the town will know that the quiet guy who fixes their cars is some kind of special forces Superman. That brings complications." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of complications?" "Well, for starters, those 3 idiots from last night. They're going to be embarrassed and angry when they sober up. Men like that, they don't handle humiliation well. Then you've got the hero worshippers who are going to want to buy you drinks and hear war stories. And the opposite, folks who are going to be suspicious of having a trained killer living in their neighborhood." She paused, letting that sink in. "Plus, there's always the possibility that someone with a grudge or a screw loose is going to see you as a challenge, test themselves against the big bad veteran." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar headache building behind his eyes. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid by keeping his head down and staying invisible. "So what do you suggest?" he asked. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward, her expression serious. "First, I think you should consider getting to know people in town, not as the mysterious mechanic, but as Marcus Thompson, veteran and neighbor. The unknown is always scarier than the known. Second, if anyone gives you trouble, and I mean anyone, you call me immediately. Don't handle it yourself unless you absolutely have to." She stood up, tucking her notebook into her shirt pocket. "And third, you might want to think about whether there's some way to use your skills and experience to help this community. We've got problems here, same as any small town. Veterans struggling with PTSD, kids getting into trouble, people who could use someone to look up to." As she reached the door, Morrison turned back. "Millfield's a good town, Marcus, but it's not perfect. Maybe having someone like you around could make it a little better." After she left, Marcus sat alone in Jim's office staring at the photographs of classic cars and thinking about the weight of expectations. He'd come to Millfield to disappear, to become nobody special, but in 15 seconds he'd reminded himself and everyone else that some things couldn't be left behind. The question now was whether he would run again or finally stop running. 3 days passed before the real test came. Marcus had settled into an uneasy routine of deflecting curious looks and politely declining invitations to tell war stories at Murphy's Diner. The initial excitement was beginning to fade when trouble found him again, this time in the form of Derek Vaughan. Derek was 26 years old, 6'3", and carried himself with the cocky swagger of someone who'd been the toughest guy in every room for most of his adult life. He worked construction when he could get it, spent his unemployment checks at Sullivan's bar, and had a reputation for picking fights with anyone who looked at him wrong. He'd heard about what happened at Murphy's, and it had been eating at him like acid in his gut. Marcus was under the hood of a Chevy Malibu, replacing a timing belt, when Derek walked into Peterson's auto shop that Friday afternoon. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and a bitter wind was rattling the windows of the service bay. "You Thompson," Derek's voice echoed off the concrete walls, aggressive and challenging. Marcus straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He'd heard Derek coming. The man's boots had announced his arrival from 50 yards away, but he'd hoped to avoid this confrontation. Derek stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides in the classic pre-fight stance. "I'm Marcus Thompson. Can I help you with something?" Derek laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Help me? Yeah, maybe you can. See, I've been hearing stories about you all week. How you took down 3 guys in 15 seconds. How you're some kind of badass army man." Jim Peterson emerged from the office, took one look at the situation, and quietly moved to the phone. He'd seen enough confrontations over the years to know when to call for backup. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "If you need work done on your vehicle, I'm happy to help. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave so I can get back to work." "See, that's the thing," Derek continued, stepping further into the shop. "I got a reputation in this town. People know not to mess with Derek Vaughn. But now everybody's talking about you instead of me. That's a problem." Marcus set down his tools with deliberate care and faced Derek directly. "Your reputation has nothing to do with me. I mind my own business, and I'd suggest you do the same." "Mind my own business?" Derek's face flushed red. "When some army boy shows up and starts throwing around my neighbors, that becomes my business. Someone needs to put you in your place." "Derek!" The voice came from behind him, firm and authoritative. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway, one hand resting casually on her service weapon. "I thought we might find you here." Derek turned, his expression shifting from aggressive to wary. "Sheriff, just came by to introduce myself to the new guy." "Uh-huh." Morrison's eyes never left Derek's face as she stepped into the shop. "And I came by because Sally Henderson called and said she saw you marching over here, like you were heading to war. Figured I might want to check on things." "Ain't against the law to visit a business, is it?" "Nope. But disturbing the peace is. Threatening behavior is. Assault is." Morrison's voice remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the words. "And all 3 of those things carry jail time." Derek glanced between Marcus and the sheriff, clearly weighing his options. Marcus could see the conflict playing out in the man's eyes, the desire to prove himself warring against basic self-preservation. "I wasn't threatening nobody," Derek muttered finally. "Just wanted to meet the famous war hero." "Well, now you've met him," Morrison replied, "so I think it's time for you to head on home. Maybe stop by Sullivan's later, buy a round for the house, show folks what a stand-up guy you are." For a moment, Derek looked like he might refuse, his hands clenched into fists, and Marcus felt his own body tensing in response, old reflexes preparing for combat. But then Derek's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight going out of him. "This ain't over," he said, pointing at Marcus. "Sooner or later it's going to be just you and me, no badges around to protect you." "Derek!" Morrison's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "If you threaten this man one more time, I will arrest you right now. Are we clear?" Derek stared at her for a long moment, then turned and stalked out of the shop without another word. Morrison waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Marcus. "You okay?" "I'm fine, thanks for showing up when you did." "Don't thank me yet. Derek Vaughn is a problem that's been building for years. He's got a hair-trigger temper, a drinking problem, and just enough intelligence to be dangerous. This won't be the last time he comes around." Jim Peterson emerged from behind a workbench where he'd been pretending to organize tools. "Maybe it's time somebody filed a complaint." "Got Derek's behavior on the record officially." Morrison shook her head. "He was careful not to cross any legal lines today, came right up to the edge, but didn't step over. He's done this dance before." Marcus wiped his hands again, though they were already clean. "So what happens now?" "Now? Now you watch your back. Derek's got friends, and they're not all as smart as he is about staying just inside the law." Morrison adjusted her duty belt and headed for the door. "And Marcus, next time you see him coming, don't try to handle it alone. Call me immediately." After the sheriff left, Jim poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Marcus. "You know, 30 years I've been running this place, and I've never had this much excitement in a single week." Marcus managed a weak smile. "Sorry about that. Seems like trouble follows me around these days." "Wasn't your fault. Derek's been looking for a fight with somebody for months. You just happened to be the most interesting target available." Jim sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Question is, what are you going to do if he comes back when the sheriff isn't around?" It was a good question, and Marcus didn't have a good answer. He'd spent 6 years learning how to neutralize threats with maximum efficiency, but those skills came with consequences. Using them against 3 drunk troublemakers in a diner was one thing. They'd been the clear aggressors, and he'd used minimal force. But Derek was different. Derek was sober, calculating, and actively hunting him. If it came down to a fight, Marcus knew he could handle Derek Vaughan. The question was whether he could handle what came after. The questions, the attention, the possibility that he might seriously hurt someone who, for all his faults, was still a member of this community. "I don't know," Marcus said finally. "I really don't know." That evening, Marcus was loading groceries into his truck outside Hartley's Market when a voice called his name. He turned to see a woman in her early 30s approaching, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and her scrubs indicating she'd just finished a shift at the medical clinic. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I wanted to thank you." Marcus set down his bag of groceries and studied her face. There was something familiar about her features, but he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "Thank me for what?" "For what you did at Murphy's the other night. Those men who bothered you? They've been harassing people around town for months. Someone needed to stand up to them." Dr. Chen glanced around the parking lot, then moved closer, lowering her voice. "One of them, the thin one, he's been following me home from work, making crude comments when I'm trying to shop. The sheriff knows about it, but they're always careful not to cross the line into anything actionable." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest. "They've been stalking you." "Not stalking exactly, just intimidating, making me uncomfortable, making it clear that they don't think I belong here." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I'm Korean American, 3rd generation, but to them, I'm just another foreigner taking up space in their town." The pieces clicked into place. Marcus remembered the thin man's words at the diner, something about real Americans and illegals. It hadn't just been about him. It had been about anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of who belonged in Millfield. "I'm sorry you've had to deal with that," Marcus said. "No one should have to put up with harassment just for doing their job and living their life." Dr. Chen smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "Sheriff Morrison told me you're a veteran. Army?" "Rangers. My brother was Army too. 2 tours in Iraq with the 82nd Airborne. He came home with PTSD and struggled for years to readjust." Her expression grew serious. "If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what you're going through, I want you to know that I'm here." Before Marcus could respond, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, its engine loud and aggressive. Derek Vaughan climbed out of the driver's seat, followed by 2 other men Marcus didn't recognize. One was older, maybe 40, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. The other was younger, probably early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was trying to prove something. "Well, look what we have here," Derek called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "The war hero's got himself a girlfriend. Dr. Chen stiffened beside Marcus, her hand moving instinctively toward the pepper spray on her keychain. Marcus stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between her and the 3 approaching men. "Evening, Derek. Gentlemen." Marcus's voice was calm, but Dr. Chen noticed the way his posture changed, becoming more centered and alert. "Beautiful night for grocery shopping." The older man, Marcus tagged him as weathered, spat into the gravel. "Ain't here for groceries, boy. Heard you've been making friends with our local Chinaman." "Dr. Chen is Korean American," Marcus replied evenly, "and she's a respected member of this community who provides medical care to people who need it." The youngest of the 3, nervous, laughed with false bravado. "Respected? She's a gook who thinks she's better than us regular folks." The racial slur hung in the air like a physical blow. Dr. Chen flinched as if she'd been slapped, and Marcus felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. "That's enough," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You need to apologize to Dr. Chen and leave. Right now." Derek grinned, sensing weakness. Or what? You gonna call your sheriff girlfriend to come save you again? No, Marcus said simply. I'm not going to call anyone. The three men exchanged glances, and Marcus could see them making the calculation. 3 against 1. No witnesses except the doctor, and no law enforcement in sight. In their minds, the odds were in their favor. They were wrong. Marcus had spent years learning to read situations, to assess threats, to determine when violence was inevitable, despite all efforts to avoid it. The body language of the three men, the way they were positioning themselves to surround him, the eager anticipation in their eyes, all of it told him that this confrontation was going to end one way. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Derek, "please get in your car and drive to the sheriff's station. I'm not leaving you alone with them. Please, trust me." Dr. Chen hesitated for a moment, then moved toward her car. Derek's head turned to follow her movement, which was exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. The fight lasted 18 seconds. Derek swung first. A wild haymaker telegraphed from 3 feet away. Marcus slipped the punch, grabbed Derek's extended arm, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the side of his pickup truck. Derek hit the metal with a sound like a sledgehammer and dropped to his knees, dazed. Weathered came next, pulling a knife from his belt and slashing at Marcus's midsection. Marcus stepped back, letting the blade pass inches from his chest, then stepped forward again and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. As Weathered doubled over, gasping, Marcus relieved him of the knife and sent him sprawling into the gravel with a precisely placed shove. Nervous, seeing his friends go down, turned to run. Marcus caught him in 3 strides, wrapped one arm around his throat, and applied just enough pressure to make him go limp. He lowered the unconscious man to the ground with almost gentle care. When Sheriff Morrison arrived 5 minutes later, summoned by Dr. Chen's call, she found Marcus sitting on his tailgate, calmly eating an apple from his grocery bag, while 3 men groaned on the ground around him. 18 seconds this time, she observed, surveying the scene. "You're getting slower." Marcus took another bite of his apple. "I'm getting older." Dr. Chen emerged from her car, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. "Sheriff, they used racial slurs and threatened both of us. Mr. Thompson was defending himself and me." Morrison nodded, pulling out her radio to call for an ambulance and backup. As she spoke to dispatch, she kept her eyes on the 3 fallen men, noting their injuries and positioning. "Self-defense?" she asked Marcus when she finished the call. "Clear case of it. They initiated contact, used threatening language, and one of them drew a weapon." Marcus held up the knife he'd taken from Weathered. "I used minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat." "Uh-huh." Morrison accepted the knife and bagged it as evidence. "Well, congratulations, Marcus. You just became the most famous man in Millfield, again." As the ambulance and backup units arrived, Dr. Chen approached Marcus's truck. "Thank you," she said simply. "No one deserves to be treated like that. No one." She studied his face in the glow of the emergency vehicle lights. "You know this isn't over, right? Derek's got friends, family. This is going to escalate." Marcus finished his apple and tossed the core into a nearby trash can. "Yeah, I know. So what are you going to do?" It was the same question Jim Peterson had asked, the same question Sheriff Morrison had implied, the same question he'd been asking himself for 3 days. But looking at Dr. Chen's face, seeing the gratitude and concern there, Marcus felt something shift inside him. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time to stop running." Word of the second confrontation spread through Millfield like wildfire. By Saturday morning, Marcus couldn't buy coffee at the gas station without being approached by someone wanting to shake his hand, thank him for standing up to Derek's crew, or share their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The quiet mechanic who'd wanted nothing more than anonymity had become, whether he liked it or not, a symbol. Marcus was trying to process this new reality while working on Mrs. Henderson's Buick, when Jim Peterson approached with a visitor, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Mayor Robert Caldwell." Caldwell extended his hand with a politician's practiced smile. "Mr. Thompson, I've been hearing quite a lot about you this week." Marcus wiped his hands before accepting the handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Mr. Mayor, what can I do for you?" "Actually, I was hoping we might have a conversation about what you can do for Millfield. Would you mind if we talked privately for a few minutes?" They moved to Jim's office, where Caldwell settled into the visitor's chair, with the comfortable ease of a man who'd spent decades in similar meetings. Marcus remained standing, leaning against the filing cabinet. "First," Caldwell began, "I want to apologize on behalf of the town for what you've had to deal with. Derek Vaughan and his friends don't represent the values of this community. I appreciate that, but I'm not looking for apologies. I just want to do my job and live quietly." Caldwell nodded. "I understand that desire. I really do. But sometimes circumstances don't allow us the luxury of staying quiet." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Can I speak frankly with you, Mr. Thompson? I'd prefer it. Millfield is dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. We've lost 3 major employers in the past 5 years. Young people graduate high school and leave for the cities. The ones who stay often struggle with unemployment, substance abuse, and a general sense of hopelessness." Marcus had seen it in other small towns. The slow hemorrhaging of opportunity and optimism that left behind only those too stubborn, too poor, or too broken to leave. "People like Derek Vaughan are symptoms of that decay," Caldwell continued. "They're angry, frustrated, and looking for someone to blame for their problems. Usually they pick on people who can't fight back, immigrants, minorities, anyone who seems different or vulnerable." "So you want me to be your enforcer? Keep the troublemakers in line?" Caldwell shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. What I'm suggesting is more complex." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Yesterday, after what happened at the market, I got 7 phone calls from business owners thanking me. Not for anything I did, but because finally someone had stood up to the bullies who've been making life miserable for decent people." Marcus felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the weight of expectations, of people looking to him for solutions he wasn't sure he could provide. "But it wasn't just business owners," Caldwell went on. "I heard from Maria Santos, who runs the bakery on Main Street. She said Derek's crew had been harassing her teenage daughter, making crude comments when she walked home from school. I heard from the Nguyen family, who own the Asian market. They've been dealing with vandalism and threats for months. What does this have to do with me? It has to do with leadership, Mr. Thompson, natural leadership. You didn't ask for this role, but circumstances have thrust it upon you. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Before Marcus could respond, the office door opened, and Sheriff Morrison stepped in. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation developing." Both men turned to face her, and Marcus noticed the tension in her posture, the way her hand rested unconsciously near her weapon. "What kind of situation?" Caldwell asked. "Derek's older brother just got into town, Tommy Vaughan. He's been in and out of prison for the past 10 years. Assault, drug-dealing, weapons charges. Word is he's looking to settle the score for what happened to Derek." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd hoped the confrontation at the market would be the end of it, but he should have known better. In his experience, violence rarely solved problems. It just created new ones. "Where is he now?" Marcus asked. "Sullivan's bar, last I heard. Drinking and talking loud about teaching the army boy a lesson." Morrison's expression was grim. "Tommy's not like Derek. Derek's a bully, but he's got limits. Tommy's genuinely dangerous." "How dangerous?" "The kind of dangerous that doesn't care about witnesses or consequences. He's already facing a parole violation just by being here. He's supposed to stay in Nebraska. He's got nothing left to lose." Mayor Caldwell stood up, his face pale. "Sheriff, what can we do? Can you arrest him preemptively?" "For what? Drinking in a bar and talking tough? That's not illegal." Morrison turned to Marcus. "But making threats against a specific person would be. If he approaches you, if he says anything that could be construed as a direct threat, I can take him in." "And how long would that hold him?" Marcus asked. 24 hours, maybe 48 if we're lucky." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar headache building. Every instinct told him to pack his bags and leave town immediately. He'd done it before, disappeared in the middle of the night, left no forwarding address, started over somewhere new. It was easier than fighting, cleaner than dealing with the complications that violence always brought. But then he thought about Dr. Chen's grateful smile, about the relief in the voices of the people who'd thanked him, about Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter, who wouldn't have to worry about Derek's crew harassing her on the way home from school. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. Morrison and Caldwell exchanged glances. "For now, stay visible. Don't hide, but don't go looking for trouble either. If Tommy wants to find you, he will. But make sure you're in public places where there are witnesses. And after that, We hope cooler heads prevail, and Tommy decides the risk isn't worth it. Morrison's tone suggested she didn't believe that was likely. But Marcus, if it comes down to a confrontation, remember that Tommy's not Derek. He's bigger, meaner, and he's got nothing to lose. After they left, Marcus sat alone in Jim's office, staring at the photographs of classic cars and thinking about the weight of choices. He could still leave, throw his tools in the back of his truck, and be gone before Tommy Vaughan sobered up. It would be the smart play, the safe play. But as he sat there, he realized that he was tired of running, tired of starting over, tired of keeping people at arm's length, tired of pretending that his past didn't matter. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like he might have found a place worth fighting for. The question was whether he could win a fight that was just beginning. Marcus was closing up the shop that evening when he heard the motorcycle. The deep rumble of a Harley-Davidson echoed off the buildings as it turned into the parking lot, and he knew without looking that trouble had arrived. Tommy Vaughan climbed off the bike like a man who owned the world. He was bigger than Derek, broader in the shoulders, thicker through the chest with the kind of muscles that came from prison yard workouts and hard living. Tattoos covered his arms in a patchwork of skulls, snakes, and words Marcus couldn't read from across the lot. "You, Thompson." Tommy's voice was rougher than his brother's, marked by cigarettes and years of shouting over bar noise. "I am." Marcus stepped out of the shop but stayed near the door, keeping his options open. "You must be Derek's brother." Tommy laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Derek tells me you sucker punched him. Says you fight dirty, hit him when he wasn't looking." "Derek's lying. He threw the first punch, and I finished it." Marcus kept his voice level, matter of fact. "If you want the truth, ask the sheriff. She's got witness statements." "Oh, I don't need to ask nobody. I can see what you are just by looking at you." Tommy started walking across the lot, his boots loud on the asphalt. "Army boy thinks he's hot shit because he learned some moves overseas. Well, I got news for you, soldier. This ain't Afghanistan, and I ain't some towelhead with an AK-47. Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him, the combat mindset that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. Tommy was big and strong, but he was also drunk, angry, and broadcasting his intentions from 50 feet away. "I don't want to fight you, Tommy. Your brother was harassing an innocent woman, using racial slurs and threatening violence. I did what any decent person would do." "Decent person?" Tommy stopped about 10 feet away, close enough that Marcus could smell the alcohol on his breath and see the rage in his bloodshot eyes. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Think because you got some fancy military training, you can come into our town and push around the locals. This isn't about better or worse, it's about right and wrong." Tommy's face twisted with contempt. "Right and wrong? You killed people for money, boy. Don't lecture me about right and wrong." The words hit harder than Tommy probably intended, striking at doubts and guilt that Marcus carried like physical weight. But instead of flinching, Marcus straightened, meeting Tommy's eyes directly. "You're right. I have killed people. But I killed enemy combatants who were trying to kill American soldiers and innocent civilians. I've never bullied women, used racial slurs, or picked fights with people who were just trying to live their lives in peace." "Thai peace?" Tommy spat into the gravel. "You want peace? Here's your peace." He came at Marcus in a rush, leading with a right cross that had probably ended a lot of bar fights over the years. But Marcus wasn't some drunk cowboy or weekend tough guy. He slipped the punch, grabbed Tommy's extended arm, and used his forward momentum to send him sprawling across the hood of a parked car. Tommy recovered faster than his brother had, rolling off the car and coming up with a knife in his hand, a fixed-blade fighting knife that looked military issue. "Now we're talking," Tommy snarled, weaving the blade in practiced patterns. "Let's see how tough you are when it's not just fists." Marcus backed away, giving himself room to maneuver. He'd trained in knife defense, but he also knew that in a knife fight, everyone gets cut. The goal wasn't to avoid injury. It was to make sure the other guy's injuries were worse. Tommy lunged forward, slashing at Marcus's midsection. Marcus jumped back, the blade missing by inches, then stepped forward and drove his elbow into Tommy's extended wrist. The knife went flying, clattering across the asphalt. But Tommy wasn't finished. He was tough, experienced, and despite the alcohol in his system, he knew how to fight. He caught Marcus with a solid left hook that snapped his head back, followed by a knee toward his ribs that Marcus barely managed to block. They grappled for a moment, testing each other's strength and technique. Tommy was bigger, But Marcus was faster and better trained. More importantly, Marcus was sober and fighting with clear purpose while Tommy was driven by rage and alcohol. Marcus broke the clinch with a sharp elbow to Tommy's ribs, then swept his legs and sent him to the ground. Tommy tried to roll away, but Marcus stayed with him, applying a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain. Tommy thrashed for a few seconds, then went limp. Marcus held the choke for another moment to make sure Tommy was truly unconscious, then released it and stepped back. Tommy would wake up in a few minutes with a headache and damaged pride, but no permanent harm. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. Someone had called the sheriff, and Marcus was grateful for it. He didn't want to have to explain an unconscious man in the parking lot without witnesses. Sheriff Morrison arrived first, followed by 2 deputies and an ambulance. She took in the scene, Marcus standing calmly beside his truck, Tommy unconscious on the asphalt, the knife gleaming in the overhead lights. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "Self-defense again." "He came looking for a fight, brought a knife to it." Marcus pointed to the weapon. "I didn't have a choice." As the paramedics checked Tommy's condition and the deputies secured the scene, Morrison pulled Marcus aside. "This is getting out of hand," she said quietly. "First Derek's crew at the diner, then the market. Now this. At what point does self-defense start looking like a pattern of violence?" Marcus understood her concern. In his experience, small-town law enforcement operated on relationships and reputation as much as evidence and procedure. Too many fights, even justified ones, could shift public opinion against him. "What do you want me to do? Let them attack innocent people? Let them attack me. I want you to be smart about this. Tommy Vaughn has friends, and some of them are worse than he is. This thing could spiral out of control fast if we're not careful." As if summoned by her words, 3 more motorcycles roared into the parking lot. The riders were cut from the same cloth as Tommy, leather-clad, tattooed, and radiating the kind of casual violence that came from lives lived on society's margins. The lead rider, a man with a grey beard and sergeant's stripes tattooed on his forearms, climbed off his bike and surveyed the scene. His eyes moved from the unconscious Tommy to the deputies to Marcus, and his expression hardened. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, her hand resting on her weapon. "Evening, Sergeant. This is a crime scene. I'm going to need you and your friends to stay back while we process it." The bearded man, Morrison had called him Sergeant, smiled without humor. "Crime scene? Looks to me like someone jumped Tommy while he was visiting his brother's town. That's not very neighborly." "Tommy brought a knife to a fist fight," Morrison replied. "Mr. Thompson was defending himself." "Mr. Thompson." Sergeant's eyes fixed on Marcus, and there was something calculating in his gaze. "You're the army boy who's been causing trouble around here." Marcus felt the situation escalating, saw the deputies' hands moving toward their weapons, sensed the volatile mix of alcohol, testosterone, and group loyalty that could turn deadly in seconds. "I'm a mechanic," he said calmly. "I fix cars and mind my own business. If people leave me alone, I leave them alone." Sergeant nodded slowly. "That's good to know because Tommy here is family, and we take care of family." It was a threat, clear and unambiguous, delivered in front of law enforcement witnesses. Marcus saw Sheriff Morrison tense, saw her calculate the odds of 3 deputies against 3 bikers in a confrontation that could leave people dead. "And I take care of the people in my community," Morrison said, her voice carrying all the authority of her badge. "All of them. So if Tommy or anyone else wants to cause trouble in my town, they'll have to go through me first." The standoff lasted for 10 long seconds, 3 bikers and 3 deputies eyeing each other, while Marcus stood in the middle, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just his future in Millfield, but possibly his survival. Then Sergeant smiled again and stepped back. "Well, Sheriff, looks like we understand each other. We'll be seeing you around." As the bikers roared away into the night, leaving Tommy to be loaded into an ambulance, Marcus realized that the war for Millfield had only just begun. The attack came 3 nights later at 2:47 a.m. Marcus woke to the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of gasoline. Through his bedroom window, he could see flames licking at the side of his apartment building, and he knew immediately that this wasn't an accident. He rolled out of bed, grabbed the go bag he kept packed from old habits, and moved to the window. 3 figures were silhouetted against the orange glow of the fire, and he recognized the distinctive shape of Molotov cocktails in their hands. They'd come to burn him out, and they didn't care who else got hurt in the process. The apartment building housed 6 units, including an elderly couple on the first floor and a single mother with 2 young children. Marcus's military training kicked in automatically: assess the threat, protect the innocent, neutralize the enemy. In that order. He pulled on jeans and boots, grabbed his phone to call 911, then opened his window and dropped his go bag to the alley below. The fire was spreading faster than it should have. They'd used an accelerant, probably gasoline, soaked into rags and stuffed through broken windows. The hallway was already filling with smoke when Marcus opened his door. He could hear Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman downstairs, calling for her husband. The single mother, Jessica, was herding her children toward the front exit, but Marcus could see that route would take them directly past the flames. "This way," he called, directing them toward the back stairs. "Stay low, keep moving." He helped Mrs. Patterson support her husband, who had emphysema and was struggling with the smoke. Jessica carried her 3-year-old while her 7-year-old son held tight to her hand, tears streaming down his face. They made it to the back alley just as the fire department sirens became audible in the distance. Marcus handed Mrs. Patterson off to Jessica, then turned back toward the building. "Where are you going?" Jessica called after him. "To find whoever did this." The 3 arsonists were still in the front parking lot, watching their handiwork with satisfaction. They'd positioned themselves near their motorcycles for a quick escape, but they'd made the mistake of assuming their target would be trapped inside the building. Marcus approached from their blind side, using the smoke and shadows for concealment. 20 years of hunting insurgents in urban environments had taught him how to move silently, how to use darkness as an ally. The first man never saw him coming. Marcus materialized out of the smoke, wrapped an arm around his throat, and applied a sleeper hold that dropped him in seconds. The man's Molotov cocktail fell harmlessly to the asphalt. The second man turned at the sound of his companion hitting the ground, and Marcus was already moving. A precise strike to the solar plexus doubled him over, followed by a knee to the face that sent him sprawling unconscious. The third man, Marcus recognized him as one of the bikers from the shop, had time to reach for the gun tucked in his waistband. But Marcus was faster, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until bones broke and the weapon clattered away. "Who sent you?" Marcus asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The biker, cradling his broken wrist, glared up at him with undisguised hatred. "Go to hell." Marcus knelt beside him, his expression deadly serious. "You just tried to burn down a building with innocent families inside. A 3-year-old girl could have died because of what you did tonight. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who sent you?" Before the biker could answer, Sheriff Morrison and her deputies arrived, followed closely by the fire department. Morrison took in the scene: 3 unconscious or injured attackers, Marcus standing calmly in the middle of it all, the apartment building blazing behind them. "Let me guess," she said, approaching Marcus while her deputies secured the scene. "Self-defense?" "They firebombed the building. 6 families live here, including children and elderly residents." Marcus's voice was tight with controlled anger. "This stopped being about me when they put innocent lives at risk." Morrison nodded, watching the firefighters battle the blaze. "The building's going to be a total loss. Where are the other residents?" "Safe. I got them out the back way before coming after these 3. The sheriff studied his face in the glow of the emergency lights. "You could have been killed trying to play hero. Someone had to do something." As the deputies loaded the 3 arsonists into patrol cars and the fire department worked to contain the blaze, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived in her personal vehicle. She'd heard the emergency calls on her scanner and had come to help with any injured civilians. She found Marcus sitting on the tailgate of an ambulance, accepting treatment for minor smoke inhalation and a few cuts from the broken glass. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "I'm fine. Mrs. Patterson and her husband need checking, though. He has emphysema, and the smoke hit him hard." Dr. Chen nodded and moved to examine the elderly couple, but not before placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Thank you for getting everyone out safely." As dawn broke over Millfield, the apartment building was a smoking ruin, but no lives had been lost. The 3 arsonists were in jail, facing charges of attempted murder and arson, and Marcus Thompson found himself once again at the center of a story that would spread throughout the town before breakfast. Mayor Caldwell arrived as the scene was being secured. his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "This has gone too far," he said to Sheriff Morrison. "We can't let outside criminals terrorize our community." "I agree, but unless we can prove these men were acting on orders, it's just 3 idiots who made a very bad decision." Morrison glanced toward Marcus, who was giving his statement to a deputy. "The question is, what happens next? Because this won't be the end of it." She was right, and everyone knew it. The attack on the apartment building had escalated things beyond personal grudges or small-town conflicts. This was now about power, territory, and respect, the kind of things that men like Sargent and his crew would never back down from. But as Marcus watched the sun rise over the ruins of his temporary home, he realized something had changed inside him. For 2 years, he'd been running from his past, trying to become someone else, somewhere else. But last night, helping those families escape the flames, he'd remembered why he'd become a soldier in the first place. Some things were worth fighting for. Some lines couldn't be allowed to be crossed, and sometimes running away wasn't an option. The war for Millfield was far from over, but Marcus Thompson was no longer running from it. The community meeting was called for 7 p.m. on Thursday, exactly 1 week after the apartment fire. The Millfield Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the town's centennial celebration 5 years earlier. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, spilling out into the hallway. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, hoping to find a spot in the back where he could observe without drawing attention. That hope died the moment he walked through the door. Conversations stopped, heads turned, and he found himself the focus of 100 pairs of eyes. Some grateful, some curious, some openly hostile. Sheriff Morrison was setting up a microphone at the front of the room, while Mayor Caldwell shuffled through notes at the podium. The mayor looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past week, the weight of responsibility etched in new lines around his eyes. "Marcus." "Doctor." Sarah Chen appeared at his elbow, her presence a welcome anchor in the sea of staring faces. "Thank you for coming. Didn't really have a choice. Mayor Caldwell made it clear my attendance wasn't optional." She studied his expression, noting the tension around his eyes. "How are you holding up? Really?" Marcus considered the question. His apartment was gone, his belongings reduced to what he'd salvaged from the go-bag. He was staying in a motel room that smelled of cigarettes and broken dreams, waiting for insurance adjusters and investigators to finish their work. 3 separate criminal organizations now considered him a target, and half the town was looking to him for solutions to problems he wasn't sure he could solve. "I've been better," he admitted. Mayor Caldwell called the meeting to order, his voice carrying over the nervous murmur of conversation. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know this has been a difficult week for our community, and I want to address the concerns that many of you have expressed." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "First, I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The events of the past week, the confrontations, the fire, the arrests, have divided our town. Some of you see Marcus Thompson as a hero who stood up to bullies and protected innocent people. Others see him as a troublemaker who brought violence to our peaceful community." A voice from the crowd called out, "What about the families who lost their homes? What about the kids who could have died in that fire?" Another voice answered, "None of that would have happened if he'd just minded his own business." The room erupted in competing shouts, neighbors turning on neighbors, friends becoming adversaries. Marcus watched it all with growing dismay, seeing how quickly fear and uncertainty could tear apart the social fabric that held communities together. Sheriff Morrison stepped to the microphone, her voice cutting through the chaos. "That's enough. We're here to solve problems, not create new ones." Gradually, the room quieted. Morrison waited until she had complete silence before continuing. "Let me lay out the facts," she said. "In the past 2 weeks, we've had 4 separate incidents involving threats, harassment, and violence. 3 of those incidents were initiated by people who don't live in this community. The 4th was a retaliatory attack that put innocent families at risk." She paused, letting that sink in. "Marcus Thompson didn't start this fight, but he's been the only one willing to finish it when it threatened people who couldn't protect themselves." An older man in the front row stood up. Marcus recognized him as Frank Sullivan, owner of the bar where Derek and his crew spent most of their time. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we had a peaceful town before this man arrived. Maybe he didn't start the fights, but he sure didn't try very hard to avoid them either." "Peaceful for who, Frank?" The voice belonged to Maria Santos, the bakery owner Mayor Caldwell had mentioned. She stood up from her seat in the middle section, her face flushed with anger. "Peaceful for you, maybe, but my daughter was being harassed every day walking home from school. The Nguyen family had their store windows broken twice this year. Doctor, Chen was being stalked by drunk men who thought she didn't belong here." She turned to face the crowd. "You call that peaceful? I call it cowardly. We all knew what was happening, and we did nothing because it was easier to look the other way." More voices joined in, the room dividing along lines that had probably existed long before Marcus arrived in town. Those who had suffered in silence found their voices, while those who had benefited from the status quo pushed back against change. Marcus listened to the arguments for 10 minutes before standing up. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed his movement, all attention focusing on him once again. "May I say something?" he asked. Mayor Caldwell nodded, stepping aside to give Marcus access to the microphone. Marcus looked out over the crowd, seeing faces he recognized from the diner, the auto shop, the grocery store. These were people he'd served coffee to, fixed cars for, nodded to in passing on the street. They weren't enemies or allies. They were neighbors trying to figure out how to live together in an increasingly complicated world. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he began, his voice calm and clear. "I'm 34 years old. I served 6 years in the United States Army, including 3 combat deployments. I came to Millfield because I wanted to start over, to find some peace after years of war." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I certainly didn't come here looking to be anyone's hero. I came here to fix cars, eat dinner at Murphy's Diner, and live quietly." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Marcus continued. "But sometimes, circumstances don't allow us the luxury of living quietly. Sometimes we're forced to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right. And when innocent people are being threatened, when families are being terrorized, when children are put in danger, that's when good people have to stand up." He looked directly at Frank Sullivan. "Mr. Sullivan, you're right that things were quieter before I arrived, but quiet isn't the same as peaceful. Quiet can mean that people are too afraid to speak up, too intimidated to ask for help, too isolated to fight back." Marcus's gaze swept the room. "I've seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. I've seen communities torn apart by fear, by hatred, by the kind of thinking that says some people matter less than others." His voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I won't apologize for defending Dr. Chen from racial harassment. I won't apologize for protecting families from arsonists. And I won't apologize for refusing to let bullies and criminals dictate how decent people live their lives." The room was completely silent now, every person hanging on his words. "But I will make you a promise," Marcus said. "If this community wants me to leave, I'll go. I'll pack my tools, get in my truck, and you'll never see me again. The choice is yours." He stepped back from the microphone, his message delivered. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Dr. Chen stood up. "I want him to stay," she said simply. Maria Santos was next. "So do I." Jim Peterson rose from his seat. "Marcus is the best employee I've ever had, and one of the finest men I've ever known. If he leaves, this town loses something valuable." One by one, other voices joined in. Mrs. Patterson, still recovering from smoke inhalation. Jessica, the single mother whose children Marcus had helped rescue. Carl, the truck driver from Murphy's Diner. A dozen others, then 2 dozen, then more. But not everyone agreed. Frank Sullivan shook his head, along with several others who still believed that avoiding conflict was preferable to confronting it. When the voices finally died down, Mayor Caldwell returned to the microphone. "It seems like this community is divided," he said. "But democracy means majority rule, and the majority has spoken." He looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, Millfield would be honored to have you stay." As people filed out of the community center, many stopping to shake Marcus's hand or thank him personally, Sheriff Morrison approached. "You realize this doesn't end here," she said quietly. "Sergeant and his crew are still out there. They're not going to forget what happened." Marcus nodded. "I know, but running away won't solve anything. If they want a fight, they'll get one, but it'll be on our terms, in our town, with our people backing us up." For the first time since he'd arrived in Millfield, Marcus felt like he truly belonged somewhere. It wasn't the peace he'd originally come looking for, but it was something better, a community worth fighting for, people worth protecting, and a place to finally stop running. The war wasn't over, but Marcus Thompson had found his ground to stand on, and he wasn't moving.